The community center had always felt like one of the last neutral places left in the city. A building that didn't demand explanations, receipts, or constant movement. A place where people could simply exist for a while, without being judged for how long they sat, how quietly they worked, or how little space they took up. And on that afternoon, I walked through its glass doors expecting nothing more than a few peaceful hours away from the chaos that had temporarily turned my apartment into an unlivable construction zone. A burst pipe in the unit above mine had flooded my living room weeks earlier, leaving exposed walls, loud machinery, and workers coming in and out at random hours. And since I worked remotely, I needed somewhere calm where I could sit with my laptop, answer emails, and let time pass without feeling like I was intruding on anyone's patience, which is why the community center had quietly become part of my routine, not as a destination, but as a refuge. I arrived a little after 2 in the afternoon, signed my name on the clipboard at the front desk like I always did, exchanged a familiar nod with the receptionist who had seen me often enough to recognize my face, and chose a seat at one of the long wooden tables near the windows where the light filtered in softly and the background noise remained just loud enough to remind you that you weren't alone without becoming distracting. Around me, the room slowly filled with the ordinary, unremarkable scenes that made the space feel alive. An elderly man hunched over a crossword puzzle, muttering to himself every time he lost his pen. A pair of teenagers whispering and laughing over something on a phone. A woman knitting methodically while waiting for her child's art class to end. And a few others scattered throughout the room who looked like they were there for the same reason I was. Not because they needed to be somewhere specific, but because they needed a place where they didn't have to justify their presence. I opened my laptop, put in my headphones, and let myself sink into work, answering messages, revising documents, and occasionally pausing just long enough to stretch my fingers or glance at the bulletin board, covered in flyers for yoga classes, grief support groups, and community potlucks. And before I realized it, time slipped forward quietly, the way it always does when nothing feels urgent, but everything still requires attention. When I finally looked up at the clock on the wall, it read just past 4, which meant I had been sitting there for nearly 2 hours without standing up, without speaking to anyone, and without doing anything remotely suspicious, though at that exact moment, I felt the subtle but unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as imagination, because public spaces naturally involve glances and passing looks. But when I casually scanned the room, my eyes landed on a woman seated a few tables away who was not glancing but staring, her posture rigid, her purse placed carefully beside her chair as if marking territory, her lips pressed together in a thin line that suggested irritation rather than curiosity. She didn't look away when our eyes met, and instead, she glanced pointedly at her watch, then back at me, repeating the motion several times as though she were timing something. And the longer she did it, the clearer it became that she wasn't just observing. She was evaluating, counting, and quietly deciding that my continued presence was a problem that required intervention. I tried to ignore it and return to my work, telling myself that not every uncomfortable feeling needs to be acknowledged. But her attention only intensified, and after a few minutes, she stood up abruptly and walked toward the front desk, speaking to the receptionist in a hushed but animated tone, gesturing repeatedly in my direction with sharp movements that made it clear who the subject of her concern was. The receptionist listened patiently, nodding in the practiced way that people develop when they deal regularly with complaints that may or may not be justified, occasionally glancing toward me and then back to the woman, and when the woman returned to her seat, she did so with a tight expression of satisfaction, as though she had just filed an official report and was waiting for consequences to follow. I felt a ripple of unease, but reminded myself that I had signed it, followed every visible rule, and behaved respectfully, and that surely whatever misunderstanding existed would be resolved quietly. But that illusion shattered when she pulled out her phone less than 10 minutes later and began speaking into it with deliberate seriousness, her voice low but intense, her body angled in my direction as though she wanted me to know exactly who the call was about. Even without hearing her words clearly, I caught fragments that made my stomach tighten. Phrases like "been here for hours, won't leave," and "making people uncomfortable," spoken with the kind of confidence that comes from believing personal discomfort is evidence enough. And when she looked directly at me mid-sentence, there was no hesitation or doubt in her eyes, only conviction. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, but noticeably as others began to sense that something was wrong, conversations quieting, knitting needles pausing mid-motion, heads lifting cautiously, and the previously relaxed space taking on a brittle tension that felt completely out of place. Among folding chairs and community flyers, 15 minutes later, the sound of approaching footsteps and radios crackling announced the arrival of the police officers, their uniforms immediately commanding attention in a space that had never been designed for authority or confrontation. And the woman stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor as she rushed toward them before they could even reach the front desk. She launched into her explanation with dramatic urgency, pointing directly at me and claiming that I had been sitting there for an unreasonable amount of time without participating in any programs, that I was just watching people, and that she felt unsafe, her voice growing louder with every sentence as though volume could substitute for evidence. The officers listened calmly, one nodding occasionally while the other glanced around the room, taking in the scene, and when they turned their attention to me, I removed my headphones, closed my laptop slowly, and stood up, making sure my movements were deliberate and non-threatening, because even when you know you've done nothing wrong, being the focus of police attention in a public space sends an involuntary surge of adrenaline through your body. I explained that I worked remotely, that my apartment was temporarily uninhabitable during the day, that I had signed in when I arrived, and that I was simply using the common area as intended. My voice steady despite the strange sensation of having my existence analyzed and challenged by a stranger. The officers asked the receptionist to confirm my account, and she immediately did, explaining that I was a regular visitor, that there was no posted time limit for sitting in the common area, and that nothing about my behavior had raised concern among the staff. Her calm professionalism standing in stark contrast to the woman's escalating frustration. The woman interrupted repeatedly, insisting that it wasn't normal for someone to sit quietly for so long, that people like me changed the atmosphere of shared spaces, and that boundaries needed to be enforced before things became dangerous. Her argument unraveling as it became clear that her concern was rooted not in rules or safety, but in control. One of the officers explained gently but firmly that sitting in a public community center was not illegal, that no policies had been violated, and that calling the police because someone made her uncomfortable without cause was an inappropriate use of emergency resources. And for the first time since I had noticed her, her expression shifted from righteous certainty to stunned disbelief. She tried to argue again, but the room itself seemed to respond before the officers could, with quiet disapproval replacing earlier curiosity, eyes no longer neutral, but clearly aware of who had disrupted the peace. And that silent judgment seemed to drain the fight from her posture. The officers concluded the interaction, thanked the staff, gave me a brief nod, and left, their departure restoring the room to something resembling normalcy, though the air still felt heavy with the residue of unnecessary tension. The woman gathered her belongings shortly after, her movements sharp and irritated, avoiding eye contact as she exited, and when the door closed behind her, the room collectively exhaled, conversations resuming hesitantly, laughter returning in fragments, the fragile ecosystem of shared space slowly reassembling itself. I sat back down, reopened my laptop, and stayed longer than I needed to, not out of stubbornness, but because leaving immediately would have felt like silently accepting a version of events that never should have existed. And as I worked, a few people nearby offered small nods or quiet smiles, gestures of solidarity that spoke louder than words. When I finally packed up to leave as the afternoon faded into early evening, the receptionist gave me an apologetic look and said softly that I was always welcome there. And as I stepped outside into the cooling air, I realized how precarious public spaces can be when entitlement disguises itself as vigilance. That day taught me that community spaces only survive when people understand that shared does not mean control, that discomfort is not the same as danger, and that sometimes the most quietly defiant act is simply sitting, existing, and refusing to apologize for taking up space longer than someone else thinks you should.